August 22nd, 2006. Before sunrise, a couple celebrating their anniversary hiked to the top of Angel's Landing in Zion National Park. Only one walked back down. For nearly 20 years, the official record called it an accident. The park cannot log what people carry in with them. What follows is 10 family road trips that ended with murder. Case 1. Gabby Petito, July 2nd, 2021, Long Island, New York. A white Ford Transit van backs out of a driveway in Blue Point, while a mother stands watching from the curb. Her daughter is 22 years old. She has been saving for this trip for the better part of a year, working 50-hour weeks at a Taco Bell and picking up side work as a nutritionist, while her fiancé took shifts at an organic juice bar nearby. 4 months on the road. National parks, open desert, mountain passes, the kind of America that opens up when you leave the interstate and follow the smaller roads west. Gabby Petito's mother, Nicole, later described the hug they shared in that driveway as one of the memories she holds closest. It was the last time she saw her daughter alive. Gabrielle Venora Petito had grown up on Long Island, the eldest of several children and half-siblings, in a family that, by the time she reached her 20s, had spread across 2 households following her parents' separation. She was the kind of person her friends describe in consistent terms: warm, energetic, someone who filled whatever room she was in. In 2017, she graduated from Bayport Blue Point High School, and within a couple of years had begun dating Brian Christopher Laundrie, a young man she had known since their school years. The relationship moved quickly. By 2020, Gabby had relocated from New York to Northport, Florida, to live with Brian and his parents, Roberta and Chris Laundrie. The arrangement was not without friction. Friends of Gabby's have since described a household dynamic that made her uncomfortable, and a relationship with Brian's mother that grew strained over time. But publicly, and online, none of that showed. Brian proposed in 2020. A firefly landed on Gabby's finger at the moment he asked, and she posted about it afterward as if the universe had confirmed something. The engagement accelerated their plans. They purchased the van, a 2012 Ford Transit Connect, in late 2020, and spent the months that followed converting the interior into a small living space. Gabby documented the build on social media alongside snippets of daily life, accumulating a following of people drawn to the aesthetic she had created around travel, simplicity, and the idea of 2 people building something together on the road. She described her interests as art, yoga, and vegetables. The channel was called by the name they gave their van life journey, and the plan for the summer of 2021 was to turn the trip into content, a real record of real movement across real places, and grow the audience substantially while they did it. What was not part of the public record at the time was that the relationship had been showing signs of serious strain for some time. Multiple people close to Gabby have described Brian as controlling in private. In one specific instance, documented during the investigation, he took her wallet and identification to prevent her from leaving independently. Gabby, by all available accounts, had learned to absorb these moments and redirect her energy outward, toward the trip and the future. Whether she understood the pattern for what it was, whether she had begun to see it clearly before July, is something no one can say with certainty now. What is clear is that she left Long Island on July 2nd, genuinely looking forward to what was ahead. The early weeks of the trip matched the image she was projecting. The couple visited Monument Rocks in Kansas, the Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado, Zion National Park, Bryce Canyon, Mystic Hot Springs, and Canyonlands. Gabby posted steadily. The photographs showed wide red landscapes, campfire light, 2 people laughing into the camera with the particular ease that comes with being outdoors and unhurried. On July 28th, she appeared in a YouTube video that drew a modest but enthusiastic response. Comments praised the footage and asked about her camera setup. Nothing in the public record of those weeks gives any indication of what was building beneath the surface. Then came August 12th. A witness in Moab, Utah, called 911 to report seeing a man hit and slap a woman in front of the Moonflower Community Cooperative near the entrance to Arches National Park. Officers from the Moab City Police Department located the white transit van shortly afterward and conducted a traffic stop. What followed was recorded on body cameras worn by the responding officers. And that footage would later be viewed by millions of people trying to understand what the police could have known that evening and what they chose to do with it. Gabby was interviewed separately from Brian. She was visibly distressed during the conversation, crying, struggling to articulate what had happened, looping back and contradicting herself. She told the officer that she had anxiety and OCD. She described the physical altercation as something she had initiated, saying she hit Brian first when an argument escalated during a stressful morning. Brian, interviewed separately, had a scratch visible on his arm. He told officers the relationship had been under pressure, that Gabby had been emotionally overwhelmed, that he was trying to be supportive. He appeared composed. The officers, operating under Moab's protocol requiring separation in domestic incidents, drove Brian to a nearby hotel for the night and allowed Gabby to remain with the van. They documented the incident as a domestic dispute in which both parties bore some responsibility, referred the matter for mental health follow-up, and cleared the scene. No charges were filed against either person. In the years since, the Moab stop has been the subject of intense scrutiny and active litigation. Gabby's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Moab City Police Department and 3 named officers, alleging negligent failure to properly investigate an assault. The suit argued that the officers had effectively witnessed evidence of domestic violence, that Gabby showed the behavioral signs consistent with someone in an abusive relationship who had been conditioned to minimize and deflect, and that different decisions made that night might have changed what happened in Wyoming 2 weeks later. Whether the litigation produces accountability remains unresolved as of this writing. Brian and Gabby separated for one night and then continued west together. On August 19th, Gabby uploaded the first video from their journey to YouTube, smiling, laughing, talking about the places they had visited. The editing was polished enough. The comments were encouraging. On August 25th, she posted to Instagram for what would be the last time, a photograph taken somewhere in Wyoming. That same day, or close to it, she spoke with her family by phone. She told them she and Brian were leaving Utah and heading to Grand Teton National Park. Her parents later described the call as unremarkable, a brief check-in of the kind that had become routine during the trip. Then the communication stopped. On August 27th, Gabby's mother received a text from her daughter's phone. The message referenced her grandfather, Stan, mentioning that she was having trouble reaching him. The wording was odd. Gabby had never called her grandfather by his first name in her life. Nicole Schmidt would later say the text landed strangely, that she couldn't quite place why it bothered her, but that it did. She tried calling. There was no answer. She tried again over the following days. Nothing came back. On September 1st, Brian Laundrie drove the white Ford Transit van into the driveway of his parents' home in Northport, Florida. He was alone. Neither Brian nor his parents communicated anything meaningful about Gabby in the days that followed. All inquiries from Gabby's family were redirected to the Laundrie's attorney, who released a brief statement saying the family intended to remain in the background while the search for Gabby was underway and would have no further comment. Gabby's father, Joe Petito, made a public appeal asking Brian's family to share anything that might help bring his daughter home. On September 11th, Nicole Schmidt filed a missing person report with the Suffolk County Police Department in New York. Investigators informed her within hours that the van had been returned to Florida without Gabby aboard. On September 15th, the FBI joined the investigation. On September 17th, Northport Police officially named Brian Laundrie a person of interest. By that point, Brian was already gone. He had told his parents on September 13th that he intended to go hiking at the Carlton Reserve, a 24,000-acre wilderness area in Sarasota County. He took a backpack, he left the house, and did not return. His parents did not report him missing until 4 days later, on September 17th. An arrest warrant was issued against him, not for murder, but for unauthorized use of Gabby's debit card, through which he had made withdrawals totaling over $1,000 during the period after her disappearance. The search for Gabby in Wyoming produced results within days of the public report. On September 19th, an FBI-led team operating in the Bridger Teton National Forest, north of Jackson and adjacent to Grand Teton National Park, located human remains in a remote area where the couple had previously been seen camping. The body had been exposed to the elements for an estimated 3 to 4 weeks. Teton County coroner Dr. Brent Blue determined the cause of death was manual strangulation, with blunt force trauma to the head also present. The remains were formally identified as Gabby Petito. She was 22 years old. The public attention the case attracted at this point was extraordinary by any measure. Because Gabby had an active social media presence, there was a searchable archive of her movements, her voice, her face, and her location data that anyone with an internet connection could access and analyze. Hundreds of thousands of people online were cross-referencing her posts, studying the body camera footage from Moab frame by frame, mapping campsite locations, and generating theories at a volume that made it impossible for investigators to track every thread. The attention also reignited a long-standing conversation about whose disappearances receive national media coverage and whose do not. The disparity, commonly discussed under the term missing white woman syndrome, was raised in congressional hearings that cited Gabby's case by name. Advocates for missing Indigenous women and women of color pointed out that cases of equal or greater urgency regularly went without a fraction of the coverage Gabby's generated. That conversation outlasted the investigation itself and has continued into subsequent years. The search for Brian Laundrie was among the largest conducted in Florida in recent memory, involving hundreds of law enforcement personnel combing through tens of thousands of acres of wilderness terrain at the Carlton Reserve and surrounding parkland. For 37 days, the search produced nothing. Then, on October 20th, Chris and Roberta Laundrie arrived at the Myakkahatchee Creek Environmental Park, adjacent to the Carlton Reserve, to assist in the search themselves. Within a short time, Roberta located a waterproof dry bag near a trail. Shortly afterward, Brian's decomposed remains were discovered nearby. A firearm was recovered at the scene. Medical examiners determined the cause of death was a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Found alongside the remains was a notebook. FBI investigators reviewed the contents and released a summary. Brian had written statements claiming responsibility for Gabby's death. The specific passage that became public through reporting described Brian making a decision to end what he characterized as Gabby's suffering following an injury she sustained in a fall, and writing that from the moment he made that decision, he knew he could not go on without her. The description he offered in the notebook was irreconcilable with what the autopsy had established. Manual strangulation and blunt force trauma are not consistent with a mercy decision made in response to a hiking accident. Gabby's family reviewed what the FBI shared with them and released a statement saying they were satisfied beyond doubt that Brian Laundrie was responsible for their daughter's death. In 2022, the Petito Schmidt family reached a settlement in a wrongful death lawsuit against Chris and Roberta Laundrie, reported at $3 million. The suit had alleged that Brian's parents knew he had killed Gabby, while investigators were still treating the matter as a missing person case, and that the family had taken a camping trip in the days immediately following Gabby's death, without alerting anyone to what they knew. The Laundries denied those specific allegations through their attorney, though the case was settled without a public admission. The broader investigation confirmed that 5 other missing persons were located as a direct result of the search effort mobilized by Gabby's case, a consequence of the unprecedented number of law enforcement personnel and volunteers combing through remote terrain that had not previously received that level of attention. None of those individuals were connected to Gabby's case. Their discoveries were incidental to it. A 3-part Netflix documentary, American Murder, Gabby Petito, was released in February 2025, drawing on interviews with Gabby's parents, friends, and investigators. Her family established the Gabby Petito Foundation, which supports search efforts for other missing persons and raises awareness around domestic violence. The foundation has continued to operate and fund searches in the years since. The trip was supposed to be the launch of something, a channel, a following, a life documented in motion. Gabby had described it to friends as the beginning of the next chapter. She had spent months building toward it, working double shifts, mapping routes, filming the van conversion one step at a time, and posting each piece as she went. The relationship it was wrapped around had been eroding in ways she may or may not have fully recognized. The stop in Moab on August 12th put that erosion in front of 2 police officers with body cameras running, and the system did not hold it there long enough to matter. What happened in Wyoming sometime around August 27th left no witness and no scene for investigators to reconstruct. The notebook Brian carried into that Florida nature reserve contained his version of events, and that version died with him in the swamp. What remains is the autopsy, the timeline, and the last photograph Gabby posted on August 25th, somewhere in the high country of Wyoming, looking out at a landscape that must have felt, for a moment, like exactly where she was supposed to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From Wyoming, the story shifts south and east to the coast of Florida, where a mother and her 2 teenage daughters drove down from their Ohio farm for the first vacation the family had ever taken outside their home state. A stranger who offered them a boat ride at sunset was the last person to see them alive. Case 2. Joan, Michelle, and Christy Rogers, May 26, 1989, Wilshire, Ohio. A small farming community in the flat northwestern corner of the state, the kind of place where most people know most other people, and the rhythms of the week are set by the land and the church calendar. Joan Rogers was 36 years old, a dairy farmer's wife with 2 teenage daughters, and a life built around the quiet demands of that kind of place. Her husband, Hal, would stay behind to tend the farm. Joan was taking the girls south. It was the first time any of them had ever left Ohio. Joan, known to everyone as Jo, had 2 daughters with her on the trip. Michelle was 17, finishing high school, old enough to have opinions about everything, and young enough to still find road travel genuinely exciting. Christy was 14, quieter than her sister, the kind of kid teachers described as thoughtful. The family had planned a Florida vacation, something simple: sunshine, theme parks, a stretch of days away from the routine of the farm. They packed the car, a 1986 Oldsmobile Calais with Ohio plates, and headed south on May 26th. Along the way, they stopped at the Jacksonville Zoo and the Kennedy Space Center. They visited Walt Disney World. By June 1st, they had made their way to Tampa and checked into a Days Inn near the water. That evening, the car was found. That evening, Jo and her daughters were last seen alive. What happened on the afternoon and evening of June 1st was reconstructed over the following 3 years through a combination of evidence collected at the scene, witness statements, and the eventual identification of the man responsible. The picture that emerged was this. Sometime during the day, possibly at a gas station or along the waterfront, the Rogers family encountered a local man who offered to take them out on his boat for a sunset cruise around Tampa Bay. The offer was charming enough. The man was friendly, familiar with the area, and gave every appearance of being exactly what he presented himself as, a local willing to show tourists something they would not find on any itinerary. Michelle and Christy, according to accounts drawn from the investigation, were enthusiastic about the idea. Jo was more cautious, but she agreed. They did not return to the Days Inn that night. Their room remained undisturbed, the beds unslept in. A housekeeper reported this to hotel management days later, after reading news coverage of what had been found in the bay. On the morning of June 4th, the bodies of 3 women were discovered floating in Tampa Bay. Each had yellow polypropylene rope tied around her neck, the other end attached to a concrete block. Their hands, feet, and mouths had been bound with duct tape. They were partially unclothed. Medical examiners determined they had been in the water for between 50 and 60 hours, placing their deaths on the evening of June 1st. The cause of death was asphyxiation, drowning or strangulation from the ropes, the water damage making it impossible to determine precisely which. There was no evidence of sexual assault that could be confirmed, though the condition of the bodies after that length of time in the water did not allow for a definitive determination. The 3 women were not identified immediately. Fingerprint records produced no match. It was 4 days before the connection was made, and it came from the Days Inn itself. A housekeeper who had read the news reports contacted police to say she believed the women described matched guests whose room had not been touched since check-in on June 1st. Investigators went to the room and matched fingerprints. Confirmation of identity came through dental records. Joan Rogers, 36. Michelle Rogers, 17. Christy Rogers, 14. Their father and husband, Hal, had reported them missing in Ohio when they failed to return home. He was eliminated from suspicion quickly, through interviews, financial records, and the fact that investigators were able to establish conclusively that he had not left Ohio during the relevant period. The Rogers Oldsmobile was located in the parking lot of a boat ramp about 2 miles from the Days Inn at the Courtney Campbell Causeway. Inside the car, investigators found a tourist brochure and a slip of Days Inn notepaper with handwriting on it. The handwriting was directions to the boat ramp where the car was now sitting and included a reference to a blue and white boat. The note was the first physical evidence linking an unknown individual to the family. Police released details about the blue and white boat publicly, hoping for tips. Hundreds came in. None of them led anywhere. By October 1989, the Tampa Police Department had no suspect and no meaningful forward movement in the case. Then a separate investigation in nearby Pinellas County opened a door. In November 1989, St. Petersburg detectives connected the Rogers murders to a rape that had occurred 2 weeks before the family arrived in Tampa on May 15th. A 24-year-old Canadian woman visiting the area with a friend had met a man at a convenience store who invited both of them onto his boat for a tour of the bay. The friend declined at the last moment. The woman went alone. Once the boat was far enough out into the Gulf of Mexico, the man raped her. She reported the crime. A sketch was produced. A description of the boat circulated. The similarities between the rape and the murders were significant enough that investigators formally linked the cases. The same body of water, the same method of approach, a friendly local offering a boat ride, the same blue and white vessel. A composite sketch of the rape suspect was released to the press alongside coverage of the Rogers case, though years passed before the connection produced a name. The breakthrough came in July 1992. By that point, the case was 3 years old and largely cold. Tampa police, running out of conventional investigative options, tried something different. They photographed the handwriting from the Days Inn note and placed it on billboards across the city. 5 of them, spread through high-traffic areas, each displaying the same enlarged image of the handwritten directions and asking the same question, "Who wrote this?" The billboards were supplemented by newspaper coverage. The response began almost immediately. A woman named Joanne Steffi contacted investigators. She recognized the handwriting. The person who had written it, she believed, was a neighbor of hers, a man who had done contract work for her in the past, installing aluminum enclosures. She had a signed contract from him in her files. She faxed it over. Handwriting analysts compared the 2 samples and found a match. The neighbor's name was Ober Chandler. Chandler was 45 years old at the time of his identification as a suspect in 1992. He had lived in the Tampa area for several years, running an unlicensed aluminum siding contracting business out of a vehicle. He had an extensive criminal history dating back to adolescence, with juvenile arrests followed by felony convictions as an adult for robbery, kidnapping, and rape. He had fathered 13 children with 12 different women over the years. He was, by the accounts of people who had employed him or dealt with him in business, difficult to read, capable of warmth and helpfulness on one hand, and sudden, frightening volatility on the other. When investigators moved to arrest Chandler after the handwriting match, they found he had left town. He was tracked to a gas station while returning to Florida and taken into custody. A search of his vehicle and his records confirmed he had owned a blue and white boat, which he had sold shortly after the murders. His fingerprints and a palm print were matched to the handwriting note recovered from the Rogers car. Ship-to-shore radio records established that a vessel registered to him had been operating in Tampa Bay on both May 15th, the date of the Canadian woman's rape, and the evening of June 1st, the last night the Rogers family was seen alive. The Canadian rape victim and her friend both identified Chandler in a lineup. At trial, which began in September 1994, Chandler took the witness stand against the advice of his attorneys. He acknowledged having met Joan Rogers and said he had given her directions to her motel. He denied being responsible for any deaths. His explanation for the ship-to-shore records was that his fuel line had burst that evening and he had been stranded on the water throughout the night. A certified marine mechanic testified that the fuel line showed no evidence of having been repaired. Chandler's own daughter, Crystal Mays, testified that her father had arrived unannounced at her home in Cincinnati shortly after a composite sketch of the rape suspect appeared in news coverage in 1989, and that during that visit he had told her and her husband that police were looking for him in connection with the murders of women, and that he had in fact raped and killed them. The jury deliberated and returned guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Chandler was sentenced to death on November 4, 1994. His appeals ran for 17 years. Each one was denied. He continued to assert his innocence throughout, writing letters, filing motions, maintaining the position that the evidence against him had been misread or fabricated. None of it moved any court in his favor. On November 15, 2011, Oba Chandler was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. His last words, delivered in response to a prison official asking if he had a final statement, were a single word: no. In the years following his conviction, DNA evidence linked Chandler to at least one additional murder, that of a 29-year-old woman whose body was found off Anna Maria Island in 1990. That case had previously been attributed to another suspect. Investigators who worked on Chandler's case believe he may have been responsible for other crimes going back to the 1960s, though he was never formally charged with anything beyond the Rogers murders and the Canadian woman's rape. The specifics of what happened to Joan, Michelle, and Christe on the water that evening have never been established with precision beyond what the evidence allows. Chandler's guilty plea or confession would have provided detail. He gave neither. What the medical evidence established was that all 3 were alive when they went into the water. The concrete blocks that were tied around their necks were not heavy enough to keep them submerged indefinitely, which is why the bodies surfaced within days. Prosecutors argued at trial that Chandler had boarded the women one at a time, bound them separately, and thrown them overboard after the boat had moved into open water, far enough from shore to make any attempt at rescue irrelevant. Joan Rogers had been cautious about getting on that boat. That detail comes from investigators' reconstruction of the encounter at the time, shaped by what they knew of her personality and the circumstances. She was a dairy farmer's wife from Wilshire, Ohio, someone who did not take risks casually and who was responsible for the safety of her daughters. She agreed to go because the man seemed harmless, and the girls were enthusiastic, and because the offer of a sunset cruise on a warm Florida evening, at the end of a good day of sightseeing, would not have seemed unreasonable to anyone who had not already encountered Oba Chandler. It was the first vacation the family had ever taken outside Ohio. Hal Rogers spent the years after his family's deaths working the farm alone and fighting to ensure that the case remained active and that Chandler's appeals did not succeed. He was present at the execution in 2011. He spoke to reporters afterward and described a feeling he struggled to name. Not satisfaction, not relief, something more complicated than either. He had waited 22 years for the legal process to reach its conclusion. The farm was still there. The dairy was still running. The Oldsmobile with the Ohio plates had long since been processed as evidence and released. The Days Inn room had been turned over to hundreds of other guests in the years between June 1989 and the day the motel eventually closed. Michelle Rogers had been excited to take the boat ride. Christy Rogers had been quieter about it, the way she was quieter about most things. Joan Rogers had looked at the man who was offering and decided, on balance, that it was fine. She had no reason to decide otherwise. The sun was going down over Tampa Bay, and her daughters were happy, and they were on vacation for the first time in their lives, somewhere south of everything they had ever known, and it looked, from where she was standing, like an ordinary evening in an ordinary life that had nothing particular to worry about. 3 days later, their bodies were in the water. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the warm water of Tampa Bay, the story moves north and west to the mountains of southern Oregon, where a young family packed their truck for a Labor Day camping weekend and vanished from a campsite so completely that it took 7 months and 2 gold prospectors to find what remained of them. Case 3. The Cowden Family Labor Day Weekend, 1974, White City, Oregon. A small town in the Rogue River Valley, the kind of place that exists in the margins of larger maps, surrounded by timber country and the kind of quiet that settles over rural communities when the working week finally stops. Richard Cowden was 28 years old, a logging truck driver who had spent the summer hauling loads across Jackson County roads he knew well enough to navigate half asleep. His wife Belinda was 22, a young mother with a 5-year-old son named David and an infant daughter named Melissa, who had been born that March and was not yet 6 months old. The family also had a basset hound named Droopy, a dog of the particular low-slung, long-eared variety that tends to attract affection from strangers. The weekend had not been planned in advance. Richard had intended to spend the holiday hauling a load of gravel to the property, working on the driveway, a practical way to use the extra days. The truck he needed for that job broke down. With the project no longer possible and the long weekend suddenly open, the family made a last-minute decision to go camping. They had camped before along Carberry Creek in the Siskiyou Mountains, near the small settlement of Copper, an area they knew and liked. The creek was cold and clear, the tree cover good, and Belinda's mother lived less than a mile from the campground. They would spend the weekend outdoors and stop in for dinner on the way home Sunday evening. On August 30th, the family arrived at the campground near Carberry Creek. They set up their site, parking their 1956 Ford pickup truck on Carberry Creek Road, a short distance from where they would sleep. Droopy settled in. The camping gear went up. A camp stove was assembled. A half-finished carton of milk appeared on the picnic table. At some point, Belinda set a plastic dishpan of cold water on the ground, possibly for the dog, possibly for washing, and left it there. Her purse went onto the table beside it. Richard's wallet and watch were placed nearby. The small, ordinary arrangements of a family making themselves comfortable in a spot they had chosen deliberately and felt at ease in. On the morning of September 1st, a Sunday, Richard and his 5-year-old son David walked to the Copper General Store, which sat close enough to the campsite that the trip was not unusual. Richard purchased milk. The two of them were seen leaving the store on foot, heading back in the direction of their campsite. That was the last confirmed sighting of any member of the Cowden family. That evening, Belinda's mother waited for the family to arrive for dinner. They had made the plan before the weekend started. A simple arrangement. Come by on the way home, have a meal, say goodbye before the drive back to White City. When they did not appear and did not call, she drove to the campground herself. What she found there stopped her completely. The truck was parked exactly where it had been left. The keys were on the picnic table. Richard's wallet was on the ground, his watch beside it. Belinda's purse remained where it had been set down. The camp stove was still assembled. The dishpan of cold water sat on the ground. The milk carton, half full and matching the one Richard had purchased at the store that morning, was on the table. Everything was exactly as it had been. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no note. There were no people. Belinda's mother notified police. The sheriff arrived, then state troopers, then officers from the District 3 office of the Oregon State Police. Lieutenant Mark Kazar, who would head the case through its most active period, later acknowledged that the investigation lost perhaps a day at the start because nothing at the campsite immediately indicated that violence had occurred. The scene was orderly. A family appeared to have simply stepped away from their belongings without explanation. The following morning, Droopy turned up at the front door of the Copper General Store, alone, scratching to be let in. The search that followed was one of the largest ever conducted in Oregon's history. The Oregon State Police, local sheriff's deputies, explorer scouts, volunteers from surrounding communities, the United States Forest Service, and the Oregon National Guard all participated. Helicopters flew over the area. Ground teams searched 25 miles of roads and trails. Hundreds of volunteers moved through terrain that grew more difficult the further it stretched from the road. The family's description was circulated statewide and eventually nationally. Tips arrived from San Francisco, from Seattle, from communities across the Pacific Northwest. People reported sightings of a woman matching Belinda's description, a child matching David's, a pickup truck that might have been theirs. Each tip was checked. None of them led anywhere. A petition was submitted to Senator Mark Hatfield requesting FBI involvement. The request was denied on the grounds that there was no evidence the family had been transported across state lines. The investigation remained with state and local authorities. By October, with the hunting season approaching, Belinda's sister published a letter in the Medford Mail Tribune asking hunters moving through the backcountry to watch for anything that might be connected to the family: clothing, equipment, disturbances in the earth. She asked them to check freshly turned soil. She understood by then that the search was no longer about finding the Cowdens alive. 7 months passed. On April 12, 1975, 2 men prospecting for gold near Carberry Creek made their way into the wooded hills above the creek, working through terrain that search teams had covered the previous fall. They found a body. It was a man, tied to a tree on a steep hillside with a leather strap, decomposed from the months of exposure. A short distance away, in a small natural cave in the rock, they found 3 more sets of remains: a woman, a child, an infant. The location was approximately 7 miles from the Cowden campsite, far enough that the area had not been a primary focus of the original search, close enough to confirm that whatever happened to the family had happened nearby. Positive identification was made through dental records. Richard Cowden, 28. Belinda Cowden, 22. David Phillips, 5. Melissa Cowden, 5 months old. Autopsies were complicated by the degree of decomposition after 7 months in the Oregon wilderness. What investigators were able to establish was that Belinda and at least one of the children had been shot with a small caliber firearm. The specific caliber most consistent with the evidence was .22. Beyond that, the condition of the remains limited what the medical examination could determine with confidence. No weapon was ever recovered at the scene or connected to any suspect through physical evidence. The investigation turned almost immediately to a man named Dwayne Lee Little. Little was 25 years old at the time of the Cowdens' disappearance. He had been paroled from the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem on May 24, 1974, 3 months before the family vanished. His prior conviction was for the 1964 rape and murder of a 16-year-old girl named Orla Faye Phipps in Springfield, Oregon. He had been 15 years old when he committed that crime. He served 8 years before being released. Following his parole in 1974, he relocated to a family property in Rouge, Oregon, a rural community in the Applegate Valley that sits in close geographic relationship to the Siskiyou Mountains and the area around Carberry Creek. State police were able to establish that Little had been in or near Copper over the Labor Day weekend, at the approximate time the Cowden family disappeared. A miner who owned a small cabin in the area kept a guest book for visitors and confirmed that Little and members of his family had signed it on Monday, September 2nd, the day after the Cowdens were last seen alive. His route to and from Rook would have taken him through or near the area where the family was camped. Little's girlfriend at the time told investigators something additional. During the Christmas holiday season of 1974, 3 months after the Cowdens disappeared and 4 months before their bodies were found, she saw Little in possession of a Little .22 caliber firearm. She reported this to police. Under the terms of his parole, Little was prohibited from possessing firearms. His parole was formally revoked on January 12, 1975, on the basis of that report. The gun itself was never definitively connected to the Cowden deaths. Little denied any involvement in the disappearances. His parents likewise denied that their son had any knowledge of what happened to the family. Then there was the matter of Russell Kelly. Kelly was a man who at one point shared a cell with Dwayne Little during one of Little's later incarcerations. In a statement provided to investigators, Kelly said that Little had confessed to the Cowden murders during their time together. The confession, as Kelly described it, was not a detailed accounting but an acknowledgement, Little indicating that he was responsible for what happened to the family at Carberry Creek. This kind of jailhouse statement carries well-documented limitations as evidence. Courts have long recognized that cellmates have complex motivations for what they report, and that statements attributed to fellow inmates do not always reflect what was actually said. Investigators were aware of these limitations. The statement was documented but never formed the basis for charges. Despite what the retired detective who led the investigation, Richard Davis, would later describe as a voluminous collection of circumstantial evidence pointing toward Little, no charges were ever filed against him in the Cowden case. Davis gave an interview decades later in which he said the case had haunted him throughout his career. He described Little as someone who offered nothing to anyone who ever questioned him, a man who had learned to simply say nothing and wait for investigators to exhaust themselves against his silence. Davis expressed regret that the family had not received justice and acknowledged that the investigation had not done everything it could have done in the critical early period after the disappearances. Little was paroled again in April 1977. In June 1980, he picked up a 23-year-old pregnant woman named Margie Hunter, whose car had broken down on Oregon Highway 99 near Portland. He drove her to an isolated location, sexually assaulted her, and beat her severely, leaving her for dead. She survived. He was convicted of that crime, sentenced to life in prison, and has remained incarcerated at the Oregon State Penitentiary ever since. Multiple subsequent parole hearings have resulted in continued denial of release. As of the time of this writing, Dwayne Lee Little has never been charged with the murders of Richard, Belinda, David, and Melissa Cowden. The case remains officially unsolved. What is known about the sequence of events over Labor Day weekend 1974 can be stated only in the barest outline. A family arrived at a campsite they had visited before. They settled in. A 5-year-old boy walked to a general store with his father on a Sunday morning, and they were seen heading back. That afternoon or evening, something happened in or near that campsite that left 4 people dead 7 miles away and took 7 months for anyone to find. The dog survived. The milk was still on the table. The purse was still there. The wallet, the watch, the dishpan of cold water. Investigators have speculated, based on the physical evidence at the discovery site, that the family was moved after death, that the killings occurred somewhere other than where the bodies were found, and that considerable effort was made to conceal what had happened. The cave where Belinda and the children were found, and the tree where Richard was tied suggested deliberate placement, not a scene left in haste. Someone had taken time. Someone had thought about what to do next. The town of Copper no longer exists. In 1980, the construction of Applegate Dam flooded the valley, and the community was submerged beneath what became Applegate Lake. The campsite near Carberry Creek, the general store where Richard and David bought milk that Sunday morning, the roads the family would have driven, all of it went under the water. The geography of the crime changed shape in a way that makes even visiting the area an exercise in imagining something that is no longer physically present. Belinda's mother spent years seeking answers. The detective who worked the case spent a career being unable to provide them. The Cowden family had no enemies that anyone who knew them could identify. They had some debt but were managing. They had a dog they liked and a campsite they had visited before, and a plan to stop for dinner on the way home that Sunday evening. The Basset Hound found his way to the general store the next morning and waited at the door, which is the kind of detail that resists easy interpretation. It suggests the dog was separated from the family at the campsite, not taken with them. It suggests that whatever happened fast enough or forcefully enough that Droopy was left behind to make his own way through a night he did not understand. The open road ends at that campground in the Siskiyous, 7 miles from where the bodies were eventually found, at a picnic table with a purse on it, and a carton of milk, and a pair of keys and a watch, and a plastic dishpan of water that had long since gone cold. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the mountains of southern Oregon, the story moves to a highway in British Columbia, where a young couple traveling through Canada in a converted van pulled to the side of the road with a mechanical problem and encountered 2 teenagers who were also moving through the country, looking for something they had not yet found. Case 4. Shinna Deese and Lucas Fowler, July 14, 2019, Highway 97, British Columbia. A long, largely empty stretch of road that cuts through the interior of Canada between the towns of Liard Hot Springs and Fort Nelson, a corridor of boreal forest and rock face that draws tourists in summer for its wilderness and its distance from everything else. The Alaska Highway, as this section is commonly known, is the kind of road that rewards people who are comfortable with silence and long gaps between fuel stops. Shinna Deese and Lucas Fowler were exactly those kinds of people. They had been traveling together for months, moving through national parks and remote highways in a converted blue van that served as their home, their transport, and the visible expression of a life they had chosen deliberately over the kind of conventional stability both of their families could have offered them. Shinna was 24 years old and from Charlotte, North Carolina. Her brother Stetson described her later as a free spirit in the most literal sense of the phrase, someone who had made peace with uncertainty, who traveled the world with genuine curiosity rather than performed adventure, who was, in his words, really adventurous and really outgoing. Her mother Sheila echoed this. Shinna had worked, saved, moved and moved again. She was not drifting. She was making deliberate choices about how to spend the portion of her life she had. She had met Lucas Fowler somewhere along the way and recognized something compatible in him. Lucas was 23 years old and Australian, from a family with deep connections to law enforcement. His father, Stephen Fowler, was a senior officer with the New South Wales Police Force in Australia. Lucas had grown up with an understanding of what that kind of career asked of a family. The hours, the weight of it, the way it followed you home, and had chosen a different direction, at least for now. He was tall, over 6 feet, physically capable, comfortable in the outdoors. His family described him after his death as someone who was living life to the full, traveling the world, vibrant and young, in all the ways that make a loss of that kind impossible to reconcile. The two of them had been in Canada for some time when their van developed mechanical trouble on the Alaska Highway. A couple who encountered them shortly before their deaths, Curtis and Sandra Broughton, later told reporters they had pulled over to help. The van appeared to be having issues. The Broughtons checked in, offered what assistance they could, and left when it seemed like Chinna and Lucas had the situation in hand. There was nothing alarming about the interaction. It was a routine roadside stop between strangers in remote country, the kind of brief exchange that happens hundreds of times a day along highways like that one. On the morning of July 15, 2019, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police responded to a report of a vehicle on the side of the highway. They found the blue van, and in a ditch close to it, approximately 5 meters apart from one another, both lying with their heads facing west, they found the bodies of Chinna Deese and Lucas Fowler. Both had been shot. Chinna was 24, Lucas was 23. The RCMP announced the deaths and opened a homicide investigation. In the early hours of the case, investigators were careful about what they said publicly. They noted that it was not yet clear whether the couple had been targeted specifically or whether this had been a crime of opportunity, someone who encountered the van on the side of the road and made a decision. They emphasized that there was no indication at that point of a broader threat to public safety in the area, though they acknowledged the finding was deeply troubling for a region that draws significant numbers of hikers, campers, and van travelers each summer. Within days, the case expanded in a direction no one had anticipated. Approximately 470 kilometers to the north, near the Stikine River Bridge on Highway 37, a burned-out pickup truck was found on July 19th. The vehicle had been deliberately set alight. 2 kilometers south of that burned truck, the body of a man was discovered. He was in his 50s or 60s, heavily built, grey-bearded. He had not been identified. The RCMP stated publicly that the circumstances bore similarities to the deaths of Chinna and Lucas, though the two sites were nearly 300 miles apart. Within a short period, investigators announced a possible link between the incidents and named 2 men they were looking for in connection with both. Cam McLeod was 19 years old. Briar Schmigelski was 18. They were from Port Alberni on Vancouver Island and had been childhood friends, having met in elementary school. Both had been working at a Walmart in the weeks before they left, a job neither of them was satisfied with. Schmigelski's father, Alan, told reporters his son and McLeod had grown tired of the work and had hit the road looking for something better, something more. He described them initially as good boys on an adventure. That framing did not survive what came next. The pickup truck that had been found burned near the Stikine River was traced to the 2 young men. The body discovered near it was subsequently identified as Leonard Dyke, a botanist from Vancouver who had been traveling in the area. He had been shot. DNA evidence and other forensic material connected McLeod and Schmigelski to all 3 deaths. The RCMP named them as suspects in the murders of Chinna Deese, Lucas Fowler, and Leonard Dyke, and issued a public warning. The 2 men were to be considered dangerous. The public was instructed not to approach them under any circumstances and to call 911 immediately if either was spotted. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in Canadian history. McLeod and Schmigelski had covered extraordinary ground in the days since the first killings. By the time the RCMP announced them as suspects on July 23rd, authorities believed they had already traversed more than 3,000 kilometers across 4 provinces. A burning Toyota RAV4 was found near Fox Lake Cree Nation, north of Gillam in northern Manitoba. That put them deep inside a vast and largely roadless wilderness, far from the Alaska Highway, where Chinna and Lucas had died. The geographic leap suggested either extraordinary resourcefulness or a series of fortunate opportunities. Vehicles obtained along the way, rides accepted or taken, the kind of movement that is possible in a country with long stretches of road between communities. Witnesses placed the pair in northern Saskatchewan on July 21st. Surveillance footage from a store in Meadow Lake captured them that same day. Band constables in the remote community of Split Lake, Manitoba, stopped them for a routine alcohol check on July 22nd and released them, having no information at that point connecting them to the murders. That roadside interaction, in retrospect, was the last confirmed sighting of either man while they were still alive. The RCMP mobilized massive resources into the Gillam area of northern Manitoba, conducting aerial searches, ground searches on foot and by water, and door-to-door inquiries through remote communities. Over 11,000 square kilometers of terrain were covered. More than 500 structures were searched. The forest in that part of Manitoba is dense and unforgiving, the kind of landscape where finding two people who do not want to be found could take months. Day after day, the search produced nothing. By late July, police publicly acknowledged they were unable to locate the suspects and were scaling back the formal search operation, though investigators remained in the area. On August 7, 2019, the remains of Cam McLeod and Briar Schmiegelski were found in the bush near Gillam. Both had died from self-inflicted gunshot wounds. They had been in the wilderness for more than 2 weeks. The discovery ended the manhunt but produced a new set of questions about motive, about the sequence of events on Highway 97, about what had driven 2 teenagers from a Vancouver Island town to cross half a continent after killing 3 people they had almost certainly never met before. The unidentified body near the burned truck was eventually confirmed as Leonard Dyke, 54, a University of British Columbia scientist who had been on a research trip in northern British Columbia. He had no known connection to McLeod or Schmiegelski. Chinner and Lucas likewise had no known connection to either young man. Investigators worked through the evidence gathered during the manhunt and concluded that all 3 victims had been killed in crimes of opportunity, that McLeod and Schmiegelski had encountered each of them by chance and had chosen, for reasons that were never fully explained, to kill them. The question of motive received considerable public and journalistic attention in the months that followed. Briar Schmiegelski's father had said before the bodies were found that he believed his son was on a suicide mission, that the young man was in serious pain and had been for some time, and that the rampage was an expression of that pain rather than any ideological or criminal plan. Friends and acquaintances who spoke to reporters described Schmiegelski as deeply introverted, someone who had struggled since his parents' divorce when he was 5 years old, and who had found it difficult to connect with most people. McLeod's background was described in less detail publicly, though his father initially refused to believe his son was involved and expressed hope he would come home safely. Psychological assessments of the pair, prepared as part of the broader investigation, were not released in full to the public. What emerged from reporting was a picture of 2 young men who had been dissatisfied with their circumstances, who had left in search of something undefined, and who had, within days of beginning that journey, committed acts of lethal violence against strangers on a remote highway, and then kept moving until the landscape swallowed them. The witness accounts from the highway added texture to the timeline. A woman named Alandra Hull told reporters that she had been driving through the area and had seen a bearded man who appeared to be in some kind of confrontation with a couple along the highway. She said the couple looked bothered by the interaction. She had a bad feeling about it and chose not to stop. The timing of what she described placed her near the location where Chinner and Lucas were found, in the hours before their deaths. The man she described loosely matched the description of Schmiegelski. Investigators took her account seriously, but no formal identification was ever made from it. For Lucas Fowler's father, Stephen, the loss arrived with a particular weight that he has spoken about publicly in the years since. As a senior police officer, he had spent his career working alongside families in exactly the situation he suddenly found himself in. A family trying to understand what had happened and whether the answer would ever be complete. He told reporters that nothing in his professional experience had prepared him for it. He said his son had been living with genuine joy. He said the family was devastated. China's mother, Sheila, described her daughter's happiness in the weeks before her death. She confirmed that the van had broken down and that the plan had been to continue traveling between Canadian national parks before finishing the trip in Alaska. She said Chinner had called home from somewhere along the road not long before she died and had sounded exactly like herself. The case generated significant discussion in Canada about safety on remote highways, particularly in northern British Columbia, an area already associated with the Highway of Tears, a stretch of Highway 16 along which at least 18 women, the majority of them Indigenous, had disappeared or been found murdered over several decades. The murders of Chinna and Lucas occurred on a different highway, under different circumstances, with identified perpetrators, but the proximity in geography and the shared element of road travel in isolated country brought the broader conversation back into public focus. Chinna Deese and Lucas Fowler had chosen to travel the way they did because it offered something that a conventional life, organized around fixed addresses and steady employment, did not. The freedom was real. The risk was not something they had ignored exactly, but it was something they had accepted as part of the terms of the life they were living. Most of the time, on most roads, in most encounters with strangers, that acceptance is never tested in any serious way. The blue van on the shoulder of Highway 97 on July 14th was the one time it was. The RCMP released security footage of the couple at a gas station 2 days before their bodies were found. The image shows Chinna and Lucas arriving together, spending a few minutes, and then driving away. They are laughing about something. The footage is grainy, in the way surveillance footage always is, and they are facing away from the camera for part of it, and there is no audio, but the body language is clear enough. They looked exactly like what they were, two young people in the middle of a trip they were enjoying, with no particular reason to believe that the road ahead was anything other than more of the same. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the remote highways of British Columbia, the story moves back across the border to the American Midwest in the summer of 2008, where a couple from Arkansas drove north to Missouri to attend a family graduation party and checked into a hotel that allowed their dogs. They never made it home. Case 5, Tom and Jill Estes, June 2008. Sherwood, Arkansas, a suburb of Little Rock, the kind of place built around schools and churches, and the particular pride people take in knowing their neighbors well enough to help them without being asked. Tom and Jill Estes had lived there long enough to be woven into the fabric of the community in the way that only comes with decades of showing up. They were both 54 years old. They had been high school sweethearts at Jennings High School in Missouri, the kind of couple whose origin story people find reassuring. Two people who found each other young and simply stayed. They had raised 2 children together, built a life that their family and friends described in consistent terms as warm, generous, and genuinely happy. Tom was known among the people who worked with him as reliable and good-humored, the kind of man who remembered details about other people's lives and asked after them. Jill carried the same reputation. Their daughter Jamie later described her parents to reporters in terms that came back repeatedly to a quality of helpfulness, that wherever they went and whoever they encountered, Tom and Jill's instinct was to make things easier for the people around them. They were also, in the way of couples who have shared their adult lives entirely, inseparable in the practical sense. They went places together. They made decisions together. When a family graduation celebration in the St. Louis area came up in late June 2008, they made plans to drive north from Arkansas together, stay a night or two, attend the party, and come home. They also brought their dogs. The choice of hotel was shaped by that. The Comfort Inn in Festus, Missouri, a small city on the Mississippi River, about 30 miles south of St. Louis, accepted pets. That made it the logical option. Festus was not where the graduation party was being held. The celebration was in the St. Louis area, which required a drive north. But the hotel worked. The location was manageable, and Tom and Jill were the kind of people who organized around what was practical. They checked in, attended the party, and on the evening of June 29th, they drove back to Festus and returned to the hotel with their dogs. What happened next unfolded in a parking lot and has been reconstructed from forensic evidence, witness accounts, and the eventual confession of the man responsible. Nicholas Shaley was 28 years old and from Sterling, Illinois, a small city in the northwest of the state. He had spent his adult life accumulating a record that stretched across multiple counties and multiple categories of offense: domestic battery, drug possession, violations of various kinds. People who knew him described someone whose moods were unpredictable, whose relationship with substances had grown steadily more consuming, and whose capacity for violence had been visible for years before June 2008, without ever producing the kind of intervention that might have changed what came next. He had married a woman named Holly in May of that year. The marriage would not survive what happened over the following weeks. On June 23rd, Sheely killed a 93-year-old man named Russell Reed in Sterling. Reed had been a farmer for 70 years, a man with no enemies and no complications in his life, someone who did not lock his doors because he had never needed to. Shelley beat him and left his body in the trunk of Reed's own car, where it was found 3 days later. He had been looking for money to buy cocaine. 5 days after that, on June 28th, Shelley drove to Galesburg, Illinois, and encountered 65-year-old Ronald Randall at a car wash. Randall was a retired Maytag worker and Army veteran who had stopped to clean his truck. Sheely beat him to death and hid his body behind a grocery store, stealing Randall's truck. That same night, using the stolen vehicle, he drove to Rock Falls, Illinois, and went to the apartment of a man named Brock Branson. Prosecutors established later that Sheely had come to believe Branson was involved with his wife. What he found when he arrived at the apartment was Branson's roommate, 25-year-old Kenneth Ulv. Sheely beat Ulv to death with a hammer. When Branson arrived home with his fiancée, 20-year-old Kelina Blake, and her 2-year-old son Diane, Sheely killed all three of them the same way. He was seen the following day wearing clothing belonging to one of the victims. The bodies of all four were found in the apartment when Branson's parents, unable to reach their son by phone, went to check on him 2 days later. Shelley had fled south into Missouri. On June 29th, the same evening that Tom and Jill Estes returned to the Comfort Inn in Festus with their dogs, Sheely was in the area. He was under the influence of drugs and alcohol, moving without a clear plan, carrying the momentum of 6 killings in a week, and looking for whatever opportunity the night presented. The Esteses encountered him in the parking lot. The precise details of what occurred in those minutes are known primarily through forensic reconstruction and through Sheely's eventual guilty plea, which acknowledged the killings but did not provide a comprehensive narrative account. What investigators established was that Tom and Jill were attacked outside the hotel after returning from the party. They were beaten. Their bodies were loaded into the bed of a pickup truck, the same stolen vehicle that had belonged to Ronald Randall, the man killed at the car wash in Galesburg the previous day, and transported approximately 1.5 miles from the hotel. They were left behind a gas station near Festus. The dogs were left alive in the parking lot. The next morning, guests at the Comfort Inn saw the Esteses dogs moving through the parking lot. The animals were covered in blood. That detail, 2 dogs, disoriented, bloodied, circling a hotel parking lot in the morning light, is the image that fixed the scene in the minds of everyone who encountered it afterward. Police were called. Officers went to the hotel room and found no sign of Tom or Jill. The room appeared undisturbed. The dogs provided the only visible evidence that something had gone terribly wrong. Investigators followed the blood trail. It ran for 1.5 miles, tracing the path from the parking lot to the gas station, where the bodies were eventually located. Tom and Jill Estes were found behind the station. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. They had been murdered the night before and driven to that spot under cover of darkness. By the time the Esteses were found, the scope of what Sheely had done over the previous week was beginning to come into focus. Law enforcement in Illinois had connected the Sterling killing, the Galesburg killing, and the Rock Falls quadruple murder to the same individual. The name Nicholas Sheely was circulating among investigators. His photograph was released publicly. A nationwide manhunt was underway. The discovery of Tom and Jill in Festus added Missouri to the geography of the case and intensified the search across state lines. On July 1, 2008, 2 days after the Esteses were killed, a group of patrons at a bar called Bindy's in Granite City, Illinois, recognized Sheely from news coverage. They called the police. Officers arrived and found him outside the bar. He surrendered without resistance. A $25,000 reward had been offered for information leading to his arrest. The manhunt that had stretched across 2 states ended at a bar parking lot, quietly, 8 days after it began. The legal proceedings that followed took nearly a decade to complete, divided across 2 states with different laws and different approaches to the most serious charges. In Illinois, where 6 of the 8 killings had occurred, Sheely was tried and convicted in a series of separate proceedings. He was convicted of the murder of Ronald Randall in Knox County in 2011. He was convicted of the murder of Russell Reed in Whiteside County in 2012. In 2014, a Rock Island County jury convicted him of the 4 murders in the Rock Falls apartment: Kenneth Ulve, Brock Branson, Kalina Blake, and 2-year-old Dayan Blake. Each conviction carried a life sentence. Illinois does not have the death penalty, which meant that regardless of how many convictions accumulated, Sheely would not face execution in that state. Missouri does have the death penalty. Jefferson County prosecutors, representing the jurisdiction where Tom and Jill Estes had been killed, formally filed notice in 2015 that they intended to pursue it. The case moved toward trial. Then, in October 2017, with jury selection imminent, Sheely entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of armed criminal action in connection with the deaths of Tom and Jill. In exchange, the death penalty was removed from the table. He received 2 additional life sentences without the possibility of parole to run alongside the 6 he was already serving in Illinois. The guilty plea meant that Tom and Jill's daughter Jaime, and others in their family who had advocated loudly and consistently for the death penalty throughout the proceedings, did not get the outcome they had sought. Jaime had spoken publicly about her parents on multiple occasions in the years between her parents' deaths and the resolution of the Missouri case. She described people who had given everything to their community and their family, who had traveled to Missouri for a celebration and encountered a man whose path crossed theirs for no reason connected to anything about who they were. The randomness of it was part of what made it so difficult to process. Tom and Jill had not done anything to bring this to their door. They had simply been in a parking lot at the wrong moment on the wrong night. Nicholas Sheely's wife Holly testified against him in the Rock Falls trial in exchange for immunity. She had not come forward voluntarily. It was only after investigators found her DNA in the stolen pickup truck that she gave a detailed account of that evening. She described the 2 of them having sex in the cab of Randall's truck on the night of the Rock Falls killings, the cab thick with blood. She said she had not immediately told police because she feared what would happen to her if she did. The defense at the Rock Falls trial pointed to Holly's delayed disclosure and questioned her credibility. The jury convicted anyway. Prosecutors across both states have described the motive behind the killing spree as a combination of factors that compounded one another in the worst possible sequence: drug and alcohol dependency that had been escalating for years, financial desperation, a jealous rage directed at Brock Branson that exploded into something Sheely could not or did not stop, and the particular momentum that comes when someone has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed and continues moving simply because stopping feels as impossible as going back. Reed was killed for drug money. Randall was killed because he was present and had a truck that Sheely needed. The 4 people in the Rock Falls apartment were killed because of the affair Sheely believed was happening. Tom and Jill Estes were killed because they walked through a parking lot at the same moment Sheely was in it. That last point received significant attention in the coverage of the case and in the victim impact statements delivered during Sheely's sentencing proceedings. The Esteses had no connection to any of the circumstances that had produced the rage and desperation driving the week's events. They were not connected to Holly or to Branson or to anyone in Sheely's world. They were an Arkansas couple attending a graduation party who chose a hotel that allowed pets and returned to their room after a celebration. They were, in the finding of Missouri prosecutors, random victims, a phrase that appears in court documents and carries within it the full weight of what it means when violence encounters ordinary life with no reason attached to it at all. Tom and Jill Estes were buried in Arkansas. Their daughter Jaime has continued to speak publicly about them in the years since, keeping their memory connected to the conversation about victims of violent crime and the way the justice system engages with survivors. She has talked about the particular difficulty of a case that moved so slowly, nearly a decade between her parents' deaths and the final resolution of all the proceedings, and what it costs a family to hold that weight across that span of time. The Comfort Inn in Festus still operates. The gas station where the bodies were found still operates. The stretch of highway between them is the same stretch of highway it has always been, running through a small Missouri city on the river that most people pass through without stopping. Tom and Jill had stopped because the hotel took dogs. It is a detail that appears in nearly every account of the case, because it is the kind of detail that reveals who people are in the ordinary texture of their lives. The kind of couple who arranged their travel around the comfort of their animals, who would not have considered leaving the dogs behind, who looked for the option that worked for everyone and found it in Festus on a map, and booked the room and drove north from Arkansas for a party. They drove home with their dogs every other time they had ever left. June 29th was the one time they did not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the parking lot in Festus, the story moves further back in time to the American Southwest of 1950, where a family of 5 from an Illinois farm was driving across the country to visit New Mexico when a hitchhiker with a handgun climbed into their car and told the father to keep driving. Case 6, the Mosser family, December 30th, 1950. A highway outside Claremore, Oklahoma. A 1949 Chevrolet had run out of fuel on the road between Claremore and Tulsa, and the man behind the wheel was standing at the roadside in the cold, waiting for someone to stop. He was 22 years old, lean and sharp-featured, with a deformed right eyelid that would not fully close, giving him the permanent appearance of someone only half asleep. On the fingers of his left hand, tattooed in block letters across the knuckles, were the words, "Hard Luck." His name was William Edward Cook, Jr., and he had been on the road since June, when the Missouri State Penitentiary released him after a sentence for car theft, and he walked out into a country that had never particularly wanted him, and that he had decided, in the prison years, he was done trying to accommodate. Billy Cook was born in Joplin, Missouri, in December 1928, the second youngest of 11 children. His mother died of a cerebral hemorrhage when he was 5 years old, and his father, faced with 11 children and no particular desire to raise them, loaded them into an abandoned mine shaft near Joplin and left them there with a few supplies. When authorities found them, the children were placed in foster care. Billy was not. His deformed eyelid made him difficult for families to accept, and the string of placements that followed each other through his childhood were largely loveless. By age 12, he had told a judge he would prefer a reformatory to another foster family. The reformatory led to the Missouri State Penitentiary, where a baseball bat assault on a fellow inmate added years to his stay. He was released in June 1950 and went briefly to his father's house, where he told the old man his plans for the future. He intended, he said, to live by the gun and roam. His father told him he wanted nothing to do with it and that he was a dangerous man. He was right on both counts. Cook drifted west to the desert town of Blythe, California, where he worked as a dishwasher until just before Christmas. He then headed east again, stopping in El Paso, Texas, long enough to purchase a .32 caliber Colt semi-automatic pistol under the name W.E. Cook, St. Louis, at a dry goods store. With the gun in his possession, he continued moving. On December 30th, outside Lubbock, Texas, he flagged down a mechanic named Lee Archer who was driving through. Cook robbed Archer of $100 at gunpoint and forced him into the trunk of his own car. Archer worked the trunk open with a tire iron somewhere down the road and escaped. The car ran out of fuel between Claremore and Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Cook found himself stranded on a highway again, needing someone else's vehicle, watching the traffic pass. That was the moment Carl Mosser stopped. Carl was 33 years old, a farmer from Benton, Illinois, a quiet and hard-working man who had loaded his family into the car for a trip west to visit New Mexico. With him were his wife Thelma, who was 29, and their 3 children, Ronald, who was 7, Gary, who was 5, and Pamela Sue, who was 3 years old. They also had the family dog. It was the period between Christmas and New Year, a time when the roads carry a certain kind of looseness, people moving between places, the year not quite finished, everything still in motion. Carl saw a man at the side of the road in the cold and did what a reasonable person in that situation does. He stopped. Cook got into the car, produced the pistol, and told Carl to drive. What followed covered 3 days and several hundred miles of American highway, an odyssey of escalating desperation that wound through Oklahoma, New Mexico, Texas, Arkansas, and back into Missouri before it ended. Cook directed Carl to keep moving, changing course when they neared populated areas, pulling away from gas stations when police vehicles came into view. At a filling station near Wichita Falls, Texas, Carl Mosser attempted to overpower Cook. He was physically larger than the man holding the gun, and he had 3 children in the car and a wife watching, and he made his move when he thought the moment was right. Cook was stronger than he looked, and the attempt failed. Carl returned to the wheel. The family endured 72 hours of this. 3 days in a car with a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to use the weapon in his hand, who slept in short, unpredictable intervals because of the eye that would not close, who offered no explanation for where they were going or what he intended to do when they arrived, and who held the gun in a way that made its presence a constant fact of every moment in that vehicle. What the 3 children experienced across those 3 days, 7-year-old Ronald, 5-year-old Gary, 3-year-old Pamela Sue, is something the documentary record cannot fully illuminate, because the documentary record ends when they do. Sometime between 1:30 and 2:30 in the morning on January 2nd, 1951, in the Chitwood section of Joplin, Missouri, not far from the mine shaft where Billy Cook had spent time as an abandoned child, Cook shot all 5 members of the Mosser family. He shot the dog as well. He carried the bodies to an abandoned mine shaft and dropped them inside. He then drove the Mossers' car to Tulsa, abandoned it, and continued west. The car was found in Tulsa with bullet holes in it and blood across the interior. The receipt from the El Paso gun shop was recovered from inside the vehicle, establishing a name and a purchase. Investigators were able to piece together that the man who had bought the gun in El Paso, and the man who had forced Lee Archer into the trunk outside Lubbock, and the man who had fled the Mosser scene were the same individual. The name circulating among law enforcement agencies across the Southwest was Billy Cook. Cook reached California and kept moving. Near Blythe, where he had worked as a dishwasher, he encountered a deputy sheriff named Homer Waldrip, who had grown suspicious and gone to the motel where Cook had previously lived to ask questions. Cook was waiting behind the door. He took Waldrip's revolver, forced the deputy into the police car, and drove him through the desert for 40 miles, during which he told Waldrip about the Mosser family and what he had done to them. He then ordered the deputy to lie face down in a ditch and told him he would shoot him in the head. He did not. He got back into the police car and drove away, leaving Waldrip alive in the dirt. Cook then picked up a traveling salesman from Seattle named Robert Dewey. At some point during the drive, Dewey attempted to wrestle the gun away. He was wounded in the struggle. The car left the road and careened into the desert scrub. Cook shot Dewey in the head and left his body in a ditch. With circulars posted across the Southwest and law enforcement agencies in multiple states actively searching for him, Cook crossed into Mexico. He drove south through Baja California to the town of Santa Rosalia, more than 400 miles below the border, where he took 2 hunters named James Burke and Forrest Damron as hostages and forced them to continue south with him at gunpoint. In Santa Rosalia, the local chief of police, Luis Parra, recognized Cook from descriptions that had filtered through the region. He walked directly up to Cook in a diner where the 3 men were seated, reached over, pulled the .32 caliber pistol from Cook's belt, and placed him under arrest. Cook did not resist. The 2 hunters were released unharmed. Cook was returned to the border and handed over to waiting FBI agents on January 15, 1951, 15 days after the Mosser family had been loaded into a mine shaft in Joplin. He was 22 years old. The question of jurisdiction was immediately complicated. 6 killings had occurred across multiple states, and prosecutors in both Oklahoma, where the Mosser family had been held at gunpoint before their deaths, and Missouri, where the murders themselves took place, wanted Cook. California had the Dewey killing. Federal charges for unlawful flight were also available. Ultimately, the cases were divided. Cook was tried first in Oklahoma for his crimes against the Mosser family. The federal judge presiding over that case declined to impose the death penalty, citing Cook's childhood as a mitigating factor and stating that he did not believe Cook possessed sufficient mental capacity to warrant execution. The United States Attorney at the time stood up in court and declared loudly that if there had ever been a case warranting the death penalty in the history of the nation, this was it. The judge did not change his position. Cook was sentenced to 300 years in federal prison in Oklahoma, 60 years for each count. He was then transferred to California to stand trial for the murder of Robert Dewey. California took a different view. Cook was convicted and sentenced to death. On December 12, 1952, at San Quentin Prison, Billy Cook was executed in the gas chamber. He was 23 years old. It had been almost exactly 2 years since Lee Archer had unlocked a car trunk with a tire iron and walked away from the road between Claremore and Tulsa. The bodies of the Mosser family were recovered from the mine shaft in Joplin after Cook's arrest. Carl and Thelma Mosser, Ronald, Gary, and Pamela Sue were returned to Illinois and buried. The dog was buried separately. The mine shaft where Cook had deposited them was close enough to the area where he had spent part of his own abandoned childhood that investigators who worked the case noted the geographic overlap without being able to say with certainty what, if anything, it meant. The case received enormous press attention at the time, in the way that crimes of that particular character tend to in the years immediately following a world war. A country that had organized itself around ideas of decency and hard work, and family, confronting the specific horror of a family in a car, on a holiday drive, being forced off the road and eventually into a mine shaft by a man who had decided the social contract was not something he owed anyone. The story of Cook's childhood was part of the coverage from the beginning. Newspapers ran the details of the abandoned mine shaft, the foster placements that failed, the years in reform schools and then in prison. Some of the coverage framed those details as explanation. Others treated them as irrelevant beside the fact of 5 people dead in the dark. Billy Cook's own statement at the time of his arrest became the most quoted thing he ever said. "I never had a friend in the world." It appeared in newspapers across the country. It was not offered as an excuse. It seems to have been offered simply as a fact, the one true thing he had to say about the life that had produced the man sitting in that Mexican diner waiting for whatever came next. The hard luck tattoo on his left hand was photographed and published widely. It became, in the popular imagination of the time, a kind of emblem for the case, a shorthand for something journalists and editorial writers struggled to articulate more precisely. There was a man who had written his own verdict on himself before he ever picked up a weapon, and the question the country chewed on afterward was whether the verdict had been placed there by the man or by the circumstances that made him. Carl Mosser had stopped because a man was standing in the cold at the side of a highway, and that was the kind of thing Carl Mosser did. He was a farmer from Illinois. He had his wife and his 3 children and his dog in the car, and he was on his way to New Mexico, and it was the period between Christmas and New Year, and the road was quiet, and the man at the side of it needed a ride. Nothing in that picture required any particular courage or charity. It was just the ordinary behavior of an ordinary person in a country that generally operated on the assumption that helping a stranger at the roadside was something neighbors did for one another. Cook had spent his life accumulating evidence that the assumption was wrong. By the time Carl Mosser stopped, Cook had enough of it to fill a prison record and a childhood and the inside of a mine shaft, and he had the gun in his coat to make the argument final. The New Mexico trip was never completed. The Mossers never arrived. No one was waiting for them on the other end of the road who could have known, while they were waiting, that the car was already somewhere in Missouri in the early hours of a January morning and had been for days. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the highways of the American Southwest, the story crosses north into the wilderness of British Columbia, where 3 generations of a single family set up camp in the mountains during the summer of 1982 and were watched for days through the trees by a man who had already decided what he was going to do. Case 7. The Johnson-Bentley Family, August 2nd, 1982. Kelowna, British Columbia. A family spread across 2 vehicles and 3 generations, loading the last of the camping gear before a 2-week trip into the interior of the province. Bob Johnson was 44 years old, a reliable and well-regarded employee at Gorman Brothers Lumber in West Bank, the kind of man his supervisors described as someone you could set your watch by. His wife Jackie was 40 years old. Their daughters were Janet, 13, and Karen, 11. Jackie's parents, George and Edith Bentley, were 66 and 59 respectively, and they had brought their own vehicle, a 1981 Ford pickup with a camper unit attached and a boat secured to the roof. The family traveled together to a campsite near Phage Creek, in the Clearwater Valley, roughly 18 kilometers north of the small town of Clearwater, and just south of the entrance to Wells Gray Provincial Park, a wilderness area of extraordinary size in the mountains of east-central British Columbia. George Bentley had a preference for secluded spots. He was a man who had spent enough time outdoors to know the difference between a campsite that offered genuine quiet and one that merely promised it, and the location near Phage Creek was the kind he favored. The trees were thick, the road in was not well traveled. The creek provided sound and coolness in the August heat. The two families set up their site in the way of people who have camped together before. The adults in the camper, the girls in a tent nearby, the boat still on the roof of the truck, the coolers positioned and the camp kitchen organized with the efficiency of a routine that has been repeated enough times to become automatic. On August 6th, Edith Bentley called one of her other daughters to say the trip was going well. The family was enjoying themselves. The weather was good. There was no particular news. It was the last confirmed contact anyone outside the campsite had with any member of the family. On August 16th, Bob Johnson did not return to work at Gorman Brothers Lumber. He had booked the time off, but was expected back that day. His absence was noted without immediate alarm. Perhaps the trip had been extended. Perhaps there was a communication issue. Perhaps something minor had delayed their return. By August 23rd, after Bob had missed multiple shifts without any contact, his employer reported the family missing to the RCMP. The report was filed 7 days after Bob was first expected back, 24 days after the last phone call. The search that followed was extensive by any measure, drawing in officers from multiple RCMP detachments, aerial support, and the kind of coordinated resource deployment that reflects how seriously the disappearance of 6 people is taken even before the nature of the disappearance becomes clear. Investigators searched provincial and private campsites across the Wells Grey area. Tips were solicited publicly. A description of both vehicles was circulated, the Johnson family car and the Bentley truck, with the distinctive camper and the boat on top. Within a short time, a tip suggested that a truck matching the Bentley's vehicle had been seen heading east, driven by French-speaking occupants. Investigators constructed a replica of the Ford camper, complete with the aluminum boat on the roof, and drove it across the country from British Columbia to Quebec and back, showing it at stops along the route and asking if anyone remembered seeing it. Nobody reliably did. The tip was eventually assessed as a false lead, though it consumed significant investigative resources in the months it was being pursued. On September 13, 1982, a berry picker working through the wooded hills above the Clearwater Valley came across a burned-out vehicle off a mountainside logging road, approximately 13 aerial miles from the Bear Creek area where the families had last been seen. The Johnson family car. Officers who arrived at the scene found skeletal remains in the back seat, 4 adults, burned beyond recognition. In the trunk, the remains of 2 children. All 6 members of the Johnson and Bentley families had been dead for weeks. Ballistic examination of the bone fragments established that each of them had been shot with a .22 caliber firearm. The Bentley truck with the camper and the boat was missing. The murder scene, the location where the killings had actually taken place, was established separately through subsequent investigation. It was at the campsite near Phage Creek, where the family had set up. The car had been moved after the deaths, driven to the logging road and burned there. Someone had loaded 6 bodies into a vehicle and driven them into the mountains and set them alight. The effort required to do that, the time and the physical work of it, indicated planning. It indicated a person who had thought about concealment. The investigation that followed produced one of the most significant failures of the initial period. The murder weapon and some of the Bentley Johnson family's possessions were in plain sight during early door-to-door inquiries in the Clearwater area. Officers spoke to a 24-year-old local man named David William Shearing. They noted him, spoke with him briefly, and moved on. Nothing in that first interaction produced the scrutiny the visit should have generated. Shearing was known in the community as someone who worked in the area, moved around the backcountry, and kept largely to himself. He raised no immediate alarm. What Shearing had been doing in the days before the killings was watching. According to his own subsequent account, he had come across the Bentley Johnson campsite several days before he acted. He had observed the family from the tree line. He had noted the adults, the children, the layout of the site, the routine the family had established. He had, by his own admission, been particularly focused on 13-year-old Janet. He watched them for days. On approximately August 10th, at dusk, he approached the campsite, armed with a .22 caliber Remington pump-action rifle. The adults were seated around the campfire. The girls were in the tent, preparing for sleep. Shearing emerged from the tree line and opened fire, shooting George, Edith, Bob, and Jackie at the campfire before they had any meaningful opportunity to respond. He then went to the tent and shot the girls. According to the account he later provided to investigators, he told them at the time that he only wanted to rob the family of their possessions and camping equipment. The statement does not hold up against what followed. Shearing did not shoot the girls at the campsite, he took them. Janet and Karen Johnson were kept alive for approximately 6 days. Shearing held them at a location away from the campsite, and during that time he sexually assaulted both children repeatedly. On approximately August 16th, the same day Bob Johnson was first expected back at work and did not appear, Shearing shot 11-year-old Karen in the back of the head. The following day, August 17th, he shot 13-year-old Janet the same way. He then gathered the bodies of all 6 family members, loaded them into the Johnson family car, drove it up a mountainside logging road at night, and set it on fire using 5 gallons of gasoline. He returned for the Bentley camper truck a few days later, intending initially to keep it. When news coverage of the missing families began appearing, and it became clear that the truck's distinctive profile, with the aluminum boat on the roof, would draw attention, he changed his mind. He drove it to a separate logging road, approximately 30 kilometers from the murder site, and burned it as well. Forestry workers found that second burned vehicle more than a year later, in October 1983. It was the camper truck, in the end, that broke the case. During the initial door-to-door inquiries in the Clearwater area, one person told officers something they did not immediately connect to anything significant. The previous year, a local man had asked them how to re-register a Ford pickup truck and how to repair a bullet hole in the door of a vehicle. That detail, the bullet hole, had never been released publicly. The information that the Bentley truck had a bullet hole in one of its doors was known only to investigators. The fact that David Shearing had been asking about repairing a bullet hole in a truck door more than a year before the burned camper was even found, established with quiet certainty that he had been in possession of the vehicle. When detectives from the RCMP's Major Crime Section, specifically Mike Eastham and Ken Liebel, went back to Shearing for a second interview in November 1983, they were prepared. Eastham was a careful and methodical investigator who had spent the 14 months since the discovery of the burned car thinking through the available evidence and the gaps in it. During the interview, conducted without coercion, Eastham steered the conversation with enough precision to get Shearing to name the murder site, a specific location that had not been made public. Shearing named it. That was enough. He was arrested on November 19, 1983, in Dawson Creek, British Columbia, more than a year after the killings. He was 24 years old. He was escorted to Kamloops under guard and charged with 6 counts of second-degree murder. On the day his trial was scheduled to begin, Shearing changed course and entered a guilty plea to all 6 counts. In a written statement submitted as part of the plea, he described the events of August 10th in the flat, compressed language of someone recounting actions rather than examining them. He said he had walked out of the bush and started shooting. He said he had put the bodies in the car. He described the fire. The statement, as rendered in court, was later assessed by investigators as partially inaccurate in its account of the girls, a version of events designed to minimize what had actually been done to Janet and Karen in the days between the campsite attack and their deaths. The fuller account of those days emerged through the investigation rather than through anything Shearing offered voluntarily. On April 17, 1984, Justice Harry Mackay of the British Columbia Supreme Court sentenced David Shearing to 6 concurrent life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years. In his remarks, Mackay described the crime as a cold-blooded and senseless execution of 6 defenseless and innocent people, a slaughter that devastated 3 generations in a single instance. Shearing became eligible for parole consideration in 2008. The National Parole Board ruled at his first hearing that he still harbored violent sexual fantasies, had not completed sex offender treatment, and was not ready for release. His second application, in 2012, was also rejected. A subsequent application in 2014 was withdrawn by Shearing himself before the hearing took place. Online and paper petitions gathered more than 15,000 signatures opposing his release. Friends and family members of the Johnson and Bentley families appeared at each hearing to speak against parole, a process that required them to revisit the details of what had happened every few years without relief. His 2021 application was denied again. As of the time of this writing, David Shearing, who now uses the surname Ennis, his mother's maiden name, remains incarcerated and is due for another parole consideration in 2026. Mike Eastham, the detective whose careful second interview produced the naming of the murder site that broke the case, retired from the RCMP and co-authored a book about the investigation called The Seventh Shadow. He has spoken publicly over the years about the case and its cost, both to the families it destroyed and to the investigators who spent years inside it. The title refers to Shearing himself, the presence at the edges of the campsite, watching from the tree line, the figure that the family did not know was there. The town of Clearwater sits at the entry point to Wells Grey Provincial Park and markets itself to visitors largely on the basis of what the park offers: wilderness, waterfalls, the particular silence of high mountain forest. The summer of 1983, the summer after the burned car was found and before Shearing was arrested, the park saw its worst tourism season in memory. Of 105 available campsites, only 18 were occupied during a Canada Day weekend, when the weather was excellent and the roads were open. People knew something had happened in those mountains. They did not yet know what or who had done it, or whether the person responsible was still somewhere in the trees. George and Edith Bentley had retired to Port Coquitlam and spent their summers camping with their daughter and her family. It was the kind of life built around continuity and repetition, the pleasures of returning to places you know and the people you love most in landscapes that have meant something across many years. The trip to the Clearwater Valley in August 1982 was not unusual. It was not their first time in that country. The secluded spot near Phage Creek was chosen because George knew what to look for in a campsite, and that site offered it. Janet Johnson was 13, Karen Johnson was 11. The tent was pitched near the adults. The campfire was going. The mountains were dark past the tree line, and the creek was audible in the quiet, and there was nothing, from inside the circle of firelight, to indicate that the dark outside, it contained anything other than the ordinary darkness of a summer night in the mountains. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the mountains of British Columbia, the story moves to the cliffs of Utah, where a husband and wife celebrating their wedding anniversary hiked to the top of one of the most dramatic trails in the American National Park system before sunrise, and only one of them was alive to describe what happened when they got there. Case 8, Bernadette Vandermeer, August 22, 2006, Zion National Park, Utah. Before the sun had risen over the canyon walls, two people were moving through the dark along a trail that most hikers choose to attempt in full daylight. Angel's Landing is among the most recognized hikes in the American National Park system, a 1,488-foot sandstone formation that requires climbers to ascend a narrow knife-edge ridge while holding chains bolted into the rock face, with sheer drop-offs on both sides that fall hundreds of feet into the canyon below. The trail draws tens of thousands of visitors each year. It also has a history of fatal falls, enough of them that the National Park Service eventually implemented a permit system to control the number of people attempting it at any given time. On the morning of August 22, 2006, David and Bernadette Vandermeer set out for the summit before dawn. They were both 29 years old, and they were celebrating their wedding anniversary. David told investigators later that they had gone up early to photograph the sunrise. Bernadette Vandermeer, born Bernadette Gudenkauf, had grown up in a family that knew her well enough to know that what happened on that trail did not fit with who she was. Her father, Richard Gudenkauf, told the Las Vegas Review-Journal in the days after the charges were finally filed 20 years later that he had done a great deal of hiking with his daughter over the years. He described her as a mountain goat. He said that for her to fall off a cliff made no sense to him and that he had felt that way from the beginning. A co-worker of Bernadette's at the New York Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, where she had been employed before the trip, contacted investigators shortly after her death and told them she was concerned about the circumstances surrounding what had happened. That concern was noted. The death was ruled an accident. The case was closed. David Vandermeer's account of the morning was consistent across his interviews with investigators at the time. He said the two of them reached the summit and that he had gone to set up the camera to photograph the sunrise while Bernadette stood near the edge of the trail. He said he moved their backpacks out of the frame of the shot, and that when he turned back around, Bernadette was gone. He said he heard her scream as she fell. He then ran along the trail looking for someone with better cell service to call 911. Bernadette's body was found hours later by detectives at the base of Angel's Landing, 1,200 feet below the trail. Investigators at the time felt the circumstances were suspicious. That language, suspicious circumstances, appears in the affidavit filed 20 years later by the Washington County Attorney's Office in Utah, reflecting the fact that officers on the scene in 2006 had reservations about what they were being told. Those reservations were not sufficient to produce an arrest or a charge. The evidence available at that moment was limited to David's account and the physical facts of the scene, and the physical facts of a fall from that height, on a trail with a documented history of accidental deaths, did not definitively contradict what David was saying. The case was closed without charges. David Vandermeer submitted a life insurance claim in November 2006, after Bernadette's death was formally ruled accidental. He received a payout of approximately $567,439 in July 2007. The insurance policies involved had been taken out in stages. A little over 17 months before Bernadette's death, the couple had purchased life insurance policies worth approximately $150,000 each. 8 months later, in November 2005, David increased those policies by $400,000 each, bringing the combined value to roughly $600,000. The timing of those increases, less than a year before the anniversary trip to Zion, became a central element of the later investigation. After collecting the insurance payment, David spent the money across a period of months on vehicles and what investigators described as all expenses paid trips for romantic partners. The romantic partners were a detail the investigation would later expand into considerably. Before Bernadette died, David had been employed as a youth pastor at a church in Las Vegas. That employment had begun before the Vandermeers married. During his tenure in that role, according to court documents filed as part of the 2026 case, David began a sexual relationship with a girl who was 16 years old and a member of his youth group. The relationship lasted approximately 4 years. The girl, identified in court documents only by her initials, SH, was of legal age by the time David and Bernadette left for Zion in August 2006, though the relationship had begun when she was a minor. The night before the Vandermeers departed for the anniversary trip, SH met with David at the church and ended the relationship. She told investigators decades later that she had broken it off because she felt it was wrong. David told her, at some point during the relationship, that the only way the two of them could ever be together properly was if Bernadette were not alive. Within 2 to 3 months of Bernadette's death, David and SH resumed their relationship. In 2008, they married. The stated reason for the marriage, according to court documents, was so that David could be added to SH's health insurance plan. He had by that point been fired from his position as a youth pastor. The termination came after church leadership received reports that David had been throwing parties at his home for underage members of the youth group, providing them with alcohol and facilitating gambling. The senior pastor of the church, Barry Diamond, said years later that he had not suspected David in connection with Bernadette's death at the time of her death, even after learning about the life insurance. It was only later, when he became aware of the relationship with SH, that he concluded a motive was visible. David and SH eventually divorced in 2014, with SH alleging infidelity. David married twice more after that. The case sat dormant for 15 years. In April 2022, the Washington County Attorney's Office in Utah received a tip from a former member of David's youth group. The tip described David as having used his position of trust to groom minors. That tip reopened the conversation between investigators and SH, who had been interviewed at various points over the years, but whose account had never produced sufficient grounds for charges. In a re-interview conducted by Lieutenant Jessica Bate of the Washington County Attorney's Office, SH provided a more detailed account than she had previously given, including David's statement that the only way they could be together was if Bernadette were not alive. That statement, taken alongside the financial evidence, the insurance timeline, the circumstances of the morning on Angel's Landing, and the testimony available from multiple witnesses about David's behavior and character, gave prosecutors enough to move forward. The investigation also produced a technical finding that proved significant. In April 2026, investigators reviewed historical sunrise data for Angel's Landing on August 22, 2006, and compared that data against the account David had given of the morning. He had told investigators in 2006 that he and Bernadette had been using headlamps when they arrived at the summit, and that visibility was limited. The sunrise data established that on that date and at the elevation of Angel's Landing, the sun did not rise until a time that was inconsistent with the lighting conditions David described. His account of when they arrived and what the conditions were like did not match the recorded astronomical facts of that morning. Investigators also analyzed decades of recorded fatal falls on the Angel's Landing trail and determined that Bernadette's fall had occurred in a location on the trail that was statistically uncommon for accidental deaths, an area where the geometry of the path and the surrounding terrain did not correspond to the typical circumstances of an accidental slip. Bernadette's father had said it made no sense for a mountain goat to fall off a cliff. The science, 20 years later, said something compatible with that instinct. On June 22, 2026, David Vandermeer was arrested in Las Vegas by the United States Marshals Service. He was 48 years old. He had been working at the time of his arrest as a counselor at a charter school called Somerset Academy Lone Mountain. The school placed him on administrative leave immediately following the arrest. He was charged with murder and insurance fraud by the Washington County Attorney's Office in Utah. The charges described a man who had carried on a sexual relationship with an underage girl while employed as a youth pastor, had told her the only path to their being together was his wife's death, had increased his wife's life insurance by $400,000 less than a year before she died on a hiking trail, and had collected nearly $570,000 in insurance money after a death that investigators at the scene had initially flagged as suspicious. David was held at the Clark County Detention Center in Las Vegas, pending extradition proceedings to Utah. An extradition hearing was scheduled for the morning of June 25, 2026. On June 24th, David Vandermeer was found at the detention center with what the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department described as self-sustained injuries. He was transported to the University Medical Center. On June 25, 2026, medical personnel at the hospital pronounced him deceased. He was 49 years old, having turned 49 the day before his death. The judge scheduled to oversee the extradition hearing was informed of the death at the start of the proceedings. He announced it to those assembled in the courtroom, including friends of Bernadette's who had traveled there hoping to finally see the beginning of a legal process that had taken 20 years to arrive. Kari Krute, who had been a close friend of Bernadette's, was present at the courthouse that morning. She had come holding a photograph of Bernadette. She had come because the arrest had seemed, after 20 years, like the beginning of something that might eventually produce the kind of formal accounting that families of victims understand as the legal system's closest approximation of acknowledgement. What she received instead was an announcement that the man who had been charged with her friend's murder had died in a jail cell the night before the first court appearance. Bernadette's family, her father Richard, her siblings, had spent 2 decades living with the knowledge that the man they believed had killed her was free, remarried, and working with children. Richard Gudenkauf's description of his daughter as a mountain goat, his statement that it made no sense for her to fall, had been part of his public account from the beginning. He had never accepted the accident ruling. The arrest in June 2026, and the charges that accompanied it, had offered something close to validation of what he had believed for 20 years. The death of David Vandermeer in custody removed the trial that might have produced a formal verdict. The insurance fraud charge raised a procedural question that the death left unresolved. The nearly $570,000 that David collected and spent in the year after Bernadette's death was gone. The vehicles he purchased with it, the trips he funded for romantic partners, the ordinary expenditures of the years that followed, none of that money was recoverable in any practical sense. Bernadette Vandermeer had worked at a hotel and casino in Las Vegas. She had married at 26 in what the public record suggests she believed was a genuine partnership. She had agreed to an early morning hike on her wedding anniversary to photograph the sunrise from the top of one of the most dramatic viewpoints in the American Southwest. Her co-worker had been concerned enough about the circumstances of her death to contact police within days of it happening. Her father had been saying for 20 years that a mountain goat does not fall off a cliff. The permits now required for Angel's Landing were introduced partly in response to the documented history of fatalities on the trail. The trail itself is unchanged, the same chains, the same knife-edge ridge, the same sheer drops on both sides. It receives thousands of visitors every year who complete it without incident and who describe it afterward in the language of accomplishment and awe. The view from the summit, in full daylight, is by most accounts extraordinary. On the morning of August 22, 2006, in the dark before sunrise, 2 people reached the top. One of them did not come back down. The legal case against David Vandermeer died in a hospital in Las Vegas on June 25, 2026, without producing a verdict. Whether that constitutes justice, or something short of it, or something else entirely, is a question that Bernadette's family and friends are left to answer for themselves in whatever way they can. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the canyon trails of Utah, the story moves to the mountains of Montana, where a young woman drove to Glacier National Park 8 days after her wedding, with a husband she had already begun to regret marrying, and made a decision at the edge of a cliff that would define the rest of her life. Case 9. Jordan Graham and Cody Johnson. 8 days. That is how long Cody Johnson and Jordan Graham had been married when Jordan drove him to a remote trail in Glacier National Park and pushed him off a cliff in the dark. 8 days from the wedding ceremony in Kalispell, Montana, to the edge of a drop that fell hundreds of feet into the canyon below. The marriage had been troubled before it began, in ways that people close to Jordan had noticed and had not known how to address, and in ways that Jordan herself had put into writing in the weeks leading up to the ceremony in a series of text messages that prosecutors would later describe as some of the most damning evidence in the case. Cody Lee Johnson was 25 years old, from Kalispell, a young man his family and friends described in the terms that appear in every tribute to someone who died before the shape of his adult life had fully formed. Kind, genuine, someone who cared about the people around him and showed it without calculation. He and Jordan had met and developed a relationship in the community, and the wedding in late June 2013 had been the kind of occasion that small Montana towns turn out for, surrounded by family and friends, and the general expectation that what was beginning would last. There is nothing in the public record of Cody Johnson that suggests he understood, as he stood at the altar, that the person he was marrying had already been telling her friends she was having serious doubts about whether she wanted to be there at all. Jordan Graham was 22 years old at the time of the wedding. In the weeks before the ceremony, she had been sending text messages to a close friend that expressed not uncertainty or nervousness of the ordinary pre-wedding variety, but something considerably more specific and troubling. According to filings by federal prosecutors in the case, Jordan had made statements about killing her mother and stepfather during that period. Those statements were introduced at trial not as evidence of a broader pattern of violence, but as evidence of Jordan's state of mind in the weeks immediately before she killed her husband, a window into the emotional landscape of a young woman who was expressing violent ideation well before July 7th. Prosecutors argued this undermined any claim that what happened at Glacier was impulsive or accidental. The night of July 7th, 2013, a week and a day after the wedding, Jordan told Cody she wanted to take a drive. They went to Glacier National Park, a place of overwhelming physical scale, the kind of landscape that makes human concerns feel temporarily small against the geology. The specific trail they accessed that evening ran along a ridge above the loop, one of the park's most dramatic vantage points, a location where the ground falls away sharply and the drop below is not a matter of ambiguity. Jordan later told investigators that the two of them had been arguing. She said Cody had grabbed her arm during the argument, and that she had reacted instinctively, pushing him away, and that he had fallen. The investigation that followed immediately called that account into question. When Cody did not return home that night, friends and family began trying to reach him and Jordan. Jordan's account of his whereabouts shifted across the early hours. She told different people different things. She told one friend that Cody had gone off with other people she did not know. She initially told a park ranger something similar. It was only after rangers began asking more specific questions that Jordan disclosed she had last seen Cody on a trail in the park and directed them to a general area. Rangers located Cody Johnson's body at the base of a cliff below the loop trail. The cause of death was the fall. He had not been there long. The physical examination of the scene and of Cody's body produced findings that federal investigators, Glacier National Park falls under federal jurisdiction, found inconsistent with the account Jordan had given. The trajectory of the fall, the position in which Cody was found, and the specific location from which he had apparently gone over the edge were examined against the available terrain and against Jordan's description of an instinctive reaction to being grabbed. The findings suggested not a reactive push but a deliberate one, from behind, delivered with sufficient force to send a physically capable 25-year-old man over a cliff edge at a location where an accidental stumble would have been difficult to produce. Jordan Graham was indicted in September 2013 on charges of first-degree and second-degree murder. Her defense attorneys argued that Cody's death had been an accident, that Jordan had pushed him reflexively when he grabbed her arm and had not intended for him to fall. They argued that the evidence did not support the conclusion that she had planned his death or had any intention of killing him when they went to the park that evening. The trial began in December 2013. Prosecutors presented the pre-wedding text messages, the shifting accounts Jordan had given in the hours after Cody's death, the physical evidence from the scene, and testimony from witnesses who described Jordan's demeanor in the days following the death as inconsistent with grief. They argued that Jordan had been deeply unhappy in the marriage before it began, that she had brought Cody to a remote and dangerous location at night, and that the manner of his death was not consistent with the accident she was describing. The defense presented a portrait of a young woman who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic and had responded to it with the confused and self-protective behavior of someone who was frightened rather than calculating. They pointed to the lack of premeditation evidence, to the fact that there had been no insurance policy, no financial motive, no prior record of violence, and to the spontaneous nature of the evening's events. Near the end of the trial, before closing arguments, Jordan Graham changed her plea. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The first-degree murder charge was dropped as part of the plea. By pleading guilty to second-degree murder, Jordan acknowledged that she had killed Cody Johnson, but did not acknowledge that she had planned to do so in advance. The plea avoided the possibility of a life sentence that a first-degree murder conviction would have carried. In March 2014, United States District Judge Donald Malloy sentenced Jordan Graham to 30 years in federal prison. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Malloy addressed the nature of the crime and the particular quality of its circumstances. A husband, dead 8 days into a marriage, pushed from a cliff in the dark by the woman who had stood beside him at an altar a week before. Prosecutors had submitted a sentencing memorandum describing Jordan as disturbingly unremorseful in the 9 days following Cody's death, a characterization the defense disputed. Jordan addressed the court briefly at sentencing and expressed remorse. Judge Malloy imposed 30 years. She was 22 years old at sentencing. She will not be eligible for release until she is in her 50s. The case generated considerable public attention at the time, partly because of its setting. Glacier National Park is one of the most photographed places in the American West, and the image of a newlywed bride driving her husband there to push him off a cliff had a specific, terrible quality that news coverage found difficult to look away from, and partly because of the text messages. The messages Jordan had sent in the weeks before the wedding, expressing doubts and making statements that went beyond ordinary cold feet, raised questions about what warning signs had been visible and whether anyone who received them had understood what they were reading. Jordan's defense attorneys, in their appeal of the sentence, argued that prosecutors had overreached in characterizing her conduct and that the 30-year sentence was excessive for a second-degree murder conviction entered through a guilty plea. The appeal raised a procedural challenge as well, arguing that Jordan should have been permitted to withdraw her plea before sentencing when she attempted to do so. Judge Malloy had denied that attempt at the sentencing hearing, ruling that the plea had been entered voluntarily and knowingly. The appeals process wound through the system in the years following the sentencing without producing a reduction. Cody Johnson's family has spoken publicly about him on multiple occasions since his death. They have described someone who was fully invested in the marriage and the life he believed he was beginning, someone who had no awareness of the doubts Jordan was carrying, and no reason to expect that the drive to Glacier on the evening of July 7th was anything other than what it appeared to be: a young couple taking a night drive through country that was, by any measure, extraordinarily beautiful. The trail above the loop in Glacier National Park continues to be used by hikers. The drop below it is unchanged. The park itself receives millions of visitors each year, drawn by the glaciers and the wildlife, and the particular quality of light that comes off the high peaks in summer. Most of the people who walk those trails at dusk do so in the uncomplicated way that landscapes of that scale invite, looking outward, looking up, attending to the world rather than to whatever they are carrying between them. Cody Johnson had been married for 8 days. He was 25 years old and from Kalispell, and by every account he had no idea that the person beside him on that trail had been telling her friends, before the wedding, that she was not sure she wanted to be there. He had no idea, because Jordan had not told him, and because the text messages that might have told someone who could have intervened were sent to a friend rather than addressed to anyone with the authority or the proximity to change what happened. He went to Glacier because Jordan suggested it, and he walked along a trail in the dark because it was something people do in that country in summer, and then the ground was gone. What Jordan Graham was thinking in those final seconds on the trail above the loop has never been fully accounted for. The guilty plea to second-degree murder established that she killed him, but not that she had planned to. Whether the trip to Glacier was conceived as an opportunity, or whether something in the argument pushed her toward an action she had not consciously decided to take beforehand, is a question the plea agreement settled legally, without resolving in any other sense. 30 years is a long time. 8 days is a very short marriage. The distance between those two numbers contains everything the case has to say about the cost of what happened on that trail, and about what Cody Johnson's family has been left to carry in the years since. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the trails of Glacier National Park, the story moves south to Colorado, where a man took his wife hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park on their wedding anniversary, and came back down the mountain alone, and where investigators who looked into the accident discovered that the same man had already buried one wife and collected on her life insurance years before. Case 10. Tony Henthorn, September 29, 2012. Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado. A Saturday afternoon in early autumn, the kind of day the park draws visitors from across the region for. Clear sky, the aspens beginning their turn toward gold, the high trails still open before the first serious snow of the season closes them down. Harold and Tony Henthorn had driven up from their home in the Denver area to mark their wedding anniversary with a hike. It was a destination the couple had visited before, a park Harold knew well enough to navigate without a map. Tony was less experienced on the trails but capable, a woman her family and friends described as someone who approached new physical challenges with genuine enthusiasm. She was 51 years old, a successful ophthalmologist, a devoted mother to a young daughter, and a woman who had found in her marriage to Harold something she understood to be stable and permanent. She had no particular reason, on the drive up into the mountains that Saturday morning, to believe the day would be anything other than what it appeared to be. Harold Lee Henthorn was 56. He described himself professionally as a non-profit fundraiser, though investigators who later examined his financial records in considerable detail found that description difficult to verify against anything in the documentary record. There was no traceable income from non-profit work of any identifiable kind across the years they examined. No contracts, no organizational affiliations that could be confirmed. No paper trail that explained how a man without a visible salary had sustained the lifestyle the couple maintained. What Harold did have, once investigators began examining his history carefully, was a pattern of behavior around the women in his life that produced, in aggregate, a picture no single incident had made fully visible on its own. The trail Harold and Tony took that September afternoon led through the park's high terrain toward a remote overlook above a rocky drop. The specific location was not a designated stopping point on any marked trail. It sat off the established path, reached by a deliberate detour that required someone to know the terrain well enough to navigate toward it intentionally. Harold had chosen it. Witnesses later confirmed that the couple had been in the park that afternoon. Harold told investigators that Tony had slipped near the cliff edge while they were pausing to take in the view. He said he reached for her. He said he had tried to grab her arm and could not hold her. He said he had watched her go over. Park rangers and first responders located Tony Henthorn's body at the base of the cliff. Her injuries were consistent with a fall from that height. Harold was visibly distressed when help arrived. He cooperated with the initial investigation. He answered questions. He provided an account that was, in its broad shape, physically possible. The death was investigated as a potential accident. There was no immediate evidence pointing in another direction, and in the early stages of the investigation, there were no obvious grounds to treat it as anything other than the tragedy Harold was describing. Then investigators began looking at Harold's past. In December 1995, Harold's first wife, Sandra Lynn Henthorne, died in Garfield County, Colorado. She was 31 years old. Harold told investigators at the time that the two of them had been working on their car alongside a rural road when the vehicle slipped from its jack and fell on her, pinning her beneath it. He said he had run to a nearby property for help. By the time anyone else arrived, Sandra was dead. The ruling was accidental death. Harold collected on a life insurance policy. Considered a loan, Sandra's death was a terrible accident with an insurance payout attached to it. Considered alongside Tony's death 17 years later, it was the second time Harold Henthorne had been the only witness to a wife's death in an isolated outdoor location, had offered an account in which he was attempting to help, and had subsequently collected a significant financial benefit. Federal investigators from the National Park Service and the FBI, working with prosecutors in the District of Colorado, began building a case that treated the two deaths not as separate and unrelated events, but as evidence of a method. The investigation into Tony's death was methodical and extensive. Financial records showed that Harold's claimed professional income did not correspond to any verifiable employment. The family's lifestyle, the home in the Denver suburbs, the vehicles, the private school Tony's daughter attended, appeared to be funded almost entirely by Tony's earnings as a physician. Tony carried a life insurance policy worth approximately $4.5 million. Harold was the sole beneficiary. Investigators spoke to people who had known the couple across the years of their marriage, and what emerged was a portrait of a relationship organized around control in ways that had been individually unremarkable but were collectively significant. Multiple witnesses described Harold as someone who managed information carefully, who inserted himself between Tony and the people who might otherwise have stayed close to her, who had created conditions in which Tony's social world narrowed steadily over the years without anyone being able to point to a specific moment when the narrowing had begun. Friends described occasions on which attempts to spend time with Tony alone had been redirected or curtailed. Family members described a relationship with her that had grown thinner as the marriage progressed, in ways they had attributed at the time to the ordinary demands of a busy professional life, and that looked different once the trial gave them a frame. A camping trip the couple had taken in 2011, a year before Tony's death, received particular scrutiny. During that trip, Tony had fallen from a camp chair in the dark and sustained injuries serious enough to require Harold to call for emergency assistance. She was airlifted out of the backcountry for treatment. The incident had been recorded as an accident at the time. After Tony's death at Rocky Mountain National Park, investigators reviewed it as part of the broader pattern, a prior occasion on which Harold and Tony had been alone in a remote outdoor setting. Tony had been seriously injured, and Harold had been the only witness to how it happened. The physical evidence at the Rocky Mountain cliff was examined in detail. The location itself required deliberate navigation off the marked trail. Harold had chosen it specifically, in a park he knew well, on terrain he had visited repeatedly. Forensic experts working for the prosecution analyzed the angle and nature of Tony's fall and produced findings inconsistent with an uncontrolled accidental slip. The trajectory, as reconstructed from the evidence at the scene and from the injuries Tony sustained, was more consistent with a push from a standing position than with a stumble. Expert witnesses testified to this at trial, and the defense challenged their methodology and their conclusions, as defenses in such cases do. Harold Henthorne was indicted in August 2014, nearly 2 years after Tony's death. The 2-year gap between the death and the indictment reflected the time it took investigators to build a case from evidence that was, at its core, circumstantial. No witnesses, no confession, no physical evidence of a hand on a back in the moment before the fall. What the prosecution had was a pattern, a financial motive of extraordinary scale, a prior death, a history of control, and expert analysis of the biomechanics of the fall itself. They argued it was enough. Harold pleaded not guilty. The trial began in September 2015, in the United States District Court for the District of Colorado. Prosecutors presented the insurance policy, the financial records, the 1995 death of Sandra, the 2011 camping incident, testimony from friends and family about the quality of the marriage, and the expert biomechanical analysis of the cliff fall. They argued that Harold had married Toni for access to her income and her insurance, had maintained a carefully managed relationship of isolation across 12 years of marriage, and had taken her to a remote and dangerous location on their wedding anniversary with the specific intention of pushing her off a cliff and collecting $4.5 million. They argued that Sandra's death in 1995 was not a separate tragedy but the first iteration of the same plan, carried out against a different woman 17 years earlier. The defense argued that the prosecution had constructed a narrative from coincidence and financial motivation. 2 accidents in one man's life, they said, did not constitute a murder case. The biomechanical analysis was speculative. Harold had loved his wife. He had been genuinely devastated by her death. Witnesses described the marriage as affectionate. There was no direct evidence, no eyewitness, no forensic proof of physical contact at the cliff edge, that Harold had done what the prosecution claimed. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Harold Henthorn was found guilty of first-degree murder on September 17, 2015. He was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. In the sentencing remarks, the court addressed the calculated nature of the crime, the betrayal it represented across 12 years of marriage, and the specific quality of cruelty involved in choosing a wedding anniversary as the occasion and a mountain trail as the location. The $4.5 million insurance payout was never made. The insurer declined to pay following Harold's arrest, a decision the conviction made permanent. Toni's family had been present throughout the proceedings. They had listened to the evidence assembled across the trial and had recognized in it the dynamics they had observed from the outside across the years of the marriage. The managed distance, the narrowing access, the way Toni had seemed less reachable as time went on. The trial gave that recognition a shape and a verdict, though it could not return the thing that mattered more than either. Toni's daughter was raised by members of Toni's family following Harold's arrest. She was young when her mother died. What she would eventually come to understand about the circumstances of that death, and about the man who caused it, was not something the trial could determine or the verdict could resolve. That was left to the people who loved Toni to navigate on her behalf across whatever years came next. Sandra Lynn Henthorn's family had spent 17 years with the official ruling that her death was an accident. The 2015 trial reframed that death in the most explicit possible terms without producing a separate charge. The statute of limitations and the available evidence made a prosecution for Sandra's death legally complicated in ways that were never fully resolved. Her family has spoken publicly about the particular difficulty of that position, knowing what the trial implied about what happened to Sandra without receiving a formal legal acknowledgement of it. The verdict in Toni's case was the closest the justice system came to saying something true about both women. Harold filed appeals in the years following the conviction. Each was denied. He remains incarcerated without the possibility of release. Rocky Mountain National Park received more than 4 million visitors in 2012. The trail Harold chose, the specific location above the cliff, does not appear on standard park maps as a destination. It was a place Harold knew. It was a place he had identified and returned to, a remote enough point in a vast enough park that an accident there would have no witnesses and would require no elaborate explanation. He had hiked in that country enough times to understand its terrain with the particular intimacy that repeated experience produces, and he had used that knowledge with precision. Toni Henthorn had driven to the park that September afternoon to celebrate 12 years of marriage with a man she had trusted across all of them. She was a physician, a mother, a woman who was present and warm with the people in her life who were able to stay close to her. The hike was Harold's suggestion. The destination within the park was Harold's choice. The stopping point above the cliff was Harold's decision, made by someone who had already stood beside the body of another wife in an isolated outdoor location 17 years earlier and walked away from it clean. There is a particular quality to the cases in this list that this one shares with several of the others. The way the road, or the trail, or the open country functions as cover. The distance from witnesses, from neighbors, from anyone who might see or hear or intervene. Harold Henthorne did not need a remote highway, or a foreign country, or a stretch of wilderness no one had mapped. He needed a section of a well-known national park that most visitors did not walk to, a clear autumn afternoon, and 12 years of a marriage in which he had already ensured that the person beside him on the trail had no one close enough to raise an alarm before it was too late. The aspens were turning when they went up that trail on September 29th, 2012. The sky was clear. The drive into the high country on a morning like that has a quality that people who have done it describe in the same terms regardless of where they started. The way the altitude changes the light, the way the peaks come into view one at a time as the road climbs. Tony had made that drive before with Harold. She had no reason to believe this time was different. The view from the edge of that cliff, in those last moments before anything else happened, was almost certainly as extraordinary as the park's reputation promised. She had gone there to see it. That much, at least, was exactly as Harold had said it would be. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.